Thank you for joining us on a Tuesday night. There are a million places you can be, but you chose to come here. And I heard that you paid to be here. So yeah, no refunds. In fact, we're going to force you to buy this book later on the way out. Yeah, please support. Anthea, could you just tell us more about this book?
Please.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I echo Xingqi's welcome and thanks for you spending time with us tonight. So the book, it's actually the first ever book that's been written about the nominated member of parliament scheme. And it's actually a edited volume. It's an anthology. It comprises personal reflection, essays from I can't remember how many NMPs already. It's been two years since we launched the book. But it has an NMP from every parliament session since we started the NMP scheme. So by the time we did the book, there were 8 parliament sessions already where we had NMPs. And what makes the book different is, other than the fact that they are personal reflections, we also have an editor's card after each chapter to go up close and personal with each NMP. So we ask them sort of more personal questions about their experience, but also about themselves as a human being.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Anthea. I think Drew, let's set some ground rules first for what a podcast should be.
Yeah, let's please do that. So we're here to have a casual conversation. I know earlier in the introduction they said that we asked a lot of witty and hard-hitting, sharp questions, I think was the word used. But this is a podcast, so we're trying to keep it casual, try and have a fun conversation, try and ask the questions that me and Xingqi are personally curious about as well. And later on, we'll have some time for you guys to ask Anthea and Walter their questions, that you have for them instead as well. But first, let me start off with a hard-hitting question for the two of you. Xingqi thanked everyone for being here on a Tuesday night. What would you normally be doing on a Tuesday night?
What would I be doing? I would be trying to catch up on the things I was supposed to do during the daytime, but I didn't quite manage to do. That's usually it. So one of the things about being an academic is that your schedule is kind of flexible. It's good and bad, right? I mean, the good thing is that you don't have to work like 9 to 5. The bad thing is that actually that also means that you don't stop working in any particular time. So usually I just because I'm lazy during the day, I just try to get more things done during the evening as well. So yeah, that's what I'd be doing.
Anthea, what do you normally spend your Tuesday nights doing?
I think not particularly anything that is a regular activity, but at this time I would likely be sort of having dinner and catching up with some podcast.
Okay.
As I'm actually having dinner, that's usually what I would be doing.
Yeah. Okay, now that we've got the hard-hitting questions out of the way, Xingqi, you can hit them with some fun ones.
Yeah, right. I mean, 2 former NMPs, Raj Joshua Thomas and Syed Harun Abafsi, recently resigned, midway through their NMP term to join the PAP. I don't know, what do you make of this, and do you think that this undermines the role of NMPs?
So if I may, I'll just talk about it maybe in 3 parts, right? I think the first part that hit me, maybe I want to address the recency of that comment about the constitutionality, right? Of NMPs resigning to join a political party, and that is true. But I would also like to say that we need to look at also the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. And I don't think any of us would say that any leaders would deliberately do something that would be illegal. But I think what we are questioning here would be more of the moral conduct of it, right? Is it an ethical way to represent the institution, a public institution? So that's, for me, a big part of it. The second part of it would be then questions I've been asking myself, right? And the first question for me that came was, is this latest move telling us the challenges of the GRC system, that is increasingly becoming difficult to find minority candidates, that therefore there was a need to actually source from the NMP slate, right? Because it is clear that these two would actually be minority candidates within a GRC system when they announce that they're running. So that was the first question that I asked. The second question I asked clearly, which I think many people have been asking, is what does it do to the NMP scheme? And other than thinking about how it really compromises on the non-partisanship, the intent of independence, of the scheme to bring in alternative voices to add value to the discourse when it was first introduced, I was also questioning whether this is a little bit of a own goal that the PAP may have scored, because the intent of the scheme was clearly to say there are alternative voices that can come through the NMP scheme. But if the NMP scheme now is being seen by voters and citizens to not quite be that non-partisan, then voters and citizens might then think, oh, then there's only one other way to have alternative voices in Parliament. And that would be, through the opposition route, right? So these two questions definitely came out for me. The third is more personal. As an alumnus of the NNP scheme, I was disappointed because, one party can invite, the other party have to say yes. So I think just that, just to have two of our own, with a scheme that anyways through the last 3 decades or more has faced its own share of criticism of not being democratic, not necessarily being able to fulfill the non-partisanship nature and the intent of the scheme. To quit before the term end instead of waiting until you finish the term and maybe have a cooling off period. Because even in the corporate sector, as leaders, as most of you would know, there's even a garden leave, right? If you're gonna actually quit from a very senior position. So that part I was personally disappointed as someone who belongs to the institution. Yes. And then, then having to ask the question of, what is left of the scheme, right? Where we are today. So that makes me sad, because I hold in such regard, and I still think it's my highest honor in my life to have served as an NMP for that term. Thank you. Took a lot longer, sorry.
Walter, your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, so I guess in a way this is a prepared question, yeah? So we knew that you were probably going to ask about this. So, maybe I'll put this in context how I think about it, right? I think what this incident has laid bare for us is actually it's exposed the essential contradictions of the NMP scheme. And I have to say, these are not contradictions I think I was completely unaware of when I began serving, but it became more apparent. So let me just outline what they are, right? So the first contradiction I think this exposes is that the scheme is fundamentally created through a partisan political process. It was obviously proposed by the People's Action Party, and it was voted basically into the constitution by them. And this is something people may not be may not be entirely aware of, although it's all there in the constitution, right? The actual selection and final say on who gets to be a nominated member of parliament is determined by a special select committee of parliament, and special select committees of parliament basically are constituted following the division of elected seats in parliament. So that means that the people who determine who is a nominated member of parliament are ultimately the People's Action Party or whoever happens to be in government, right? That's actually who selects your NMPs. But at the same time, right? It's a partisan political process that generates it. But at the same time, the Constitution very specifically says that the special select committee shall have regard to representing as wide a range of independent and non-partisan views as possible. So I might have got the exact wording wrong, but basically the Constitution, which of course the partisan process created, very specifically says that the NMPs are to reflect independent and non-partisan views. So that's the contradiction. The contradiction is that you have to have a bunch of politicians belonging to one party who have to set aside their party political hats while nominating and selecting NMPs. If they don't do that, then the entire thing is for naught, yeah? I mean, it doesn't make sense if they don't do their best to set aside their partisan political hats while doing so. But I think what this situation has shown us is that it would cause, I think, a reasonable person to doubt whether the process of setting aside your partisan political hats was as effective as it could have been. Can a member of parliament for the PAP really tell themselves, I'm going to be selecting a nominated member of parliament based purely on what the Constitution says about independence and non-partisan views, and not at all with any regard to whether this person might help my party or not? Can somebody really do that? I think this causes some doubt about that, right? So that's one contradiction. The other contradiction I think I would just touch on became a bit more obvious to me, I think, after serving, is that in many ways, an effective nominated member of parliament actually has to be a politician who does not want to be a politician. Why I say that is that actually an NMP is, in my view, ineffective if they actually approach the entire exercise basically purely as somebody who wants to contribute to the proceedings of Parliament, have dialogues with ministers, and so on and so forth. The only power that a nominated member of Parliament effectively has is to raise issues in a way that resonates with the public, thereby causing elected members of parliament, primarily the government, to have second or third thoughts about something they want to do. That's the only power a nominated member of parliament has. You can ask all the questions you want, file them, you can give all the wonderful or not wonderful speeches you want, but the only reason why a minister would listen to what you have to say is that they would have a view of feeling that maybe what you're saying is capturing some kind of view among the electorate, right? But then to get the electorate to support your kind of view, you must be a politician. You must actually know how to convey your views in a way that actually attracts popular imagination or appeals to somebody in the electorate or something like that. And that is the contradiction, right? And therefore, from a certain point of view, I do not necessarily blame, you might say, the two NMPs who stood down for realizing that they should just take this to the logical extreme and in fact be a politician as well. But that's their choice anyway.
Yeah, I was wondering a bit about that because Anthea, you mentioned that you were disappointed that perhaps they didn't see out their term. Singh interviewed Raj Joshua Thomas a few weeks ago, and one of the reasons, the main reason he gave us for why he decided to step down was he realized that I guess he wanted to be a member of the PAP, or he was very aligned with the PAP. So if you were in his shoes, if you realized halfway through your term that I feel I'm very aligned with the PAP, or maybe the WP, or even, nowadays the PSP as well, would you have stepped down?
So I don't think it would happen within a day, right? That you suddenly realize that I have changed my affiliation or alignment. And so that's the part that I think also, bothers me a little bit. I know that they both resigned on the 14th of February, and I remember it because everyone talks about it being Valentine's Day. But they don't just change their affiliation on the 13th of February and therefore immediately then step down so that they are true to, the system, right? Or the call of the NMP scheme. So to your question of whether I would say that what Walter said, really resonated to the point of my own experience. I actually said no the very first time I was invited to consider the NMP position in 2011 because I felt like, being in politics wasn't for me, and I knew I was going to quit my corporate sector to do this full-time, being on the ground, do what I can in terms of the work in the people and civic sector. yeah, so, being a politician was never what I was going for. The only reason I said yes in 2018 was in the 7 years since I was asked, I felt like there were so many things that I just felt were not about how much work or how good the work that we do on the ground, but there were structural barriers that can only be changed by policies. Right, and in my case, it's mental health, which is also why in my term, I hammer home the need for, the mental health reforms that we need in our mental health care system, in our policies, in education, in workplaces, and all of that. So that's why I said yes. So I think Walter's point, it's correct to the sense that maybe a certain effectiveness comes about when you have no inkling to being a politician, when you are in an NMP shoes. So I would probably never consider, and then, it's a bit moot, but I would not consider, joining any political party. So I would not be put in that position, that hypothetical position that you asked me. But if I was, I would still want to serve out the term. In just how much I would like to honor this public institution that we have to keep the trust of for the people, right?
Right. I mean, you don't want to join a party, but did they ask you guys for tea, along the way? Yeah.
No. I mean, we had tea when we were NMPs.
They always
kind of
wanted.
tea, yeah.
They always wanted to have tea with you when they wanted your support on something, and they had an inkling that you might not quite give it unreserved support for that thing, whatever it is. So yeah, that's when people want to have tea with you. Actually, when they need something from you.
So you're talking about before we became NMP.
Or even while. I mean, it sounds
right.
With the two that resigned recently, they had those conversations.
They must have, because like I said, you couldn't have made that decision on the 13th, and therefore you have to quit on the 14th just to stay true to the intent and the sanctity of the non-partisanship of NMP scheme. We had tea. So we had tea, and I posted very openly about it. We had teas in the Istana with the Prime Minister, with the President, with the ESM go. We also have chats often in the members' room in Parliament. But interestingly, when we first joined, we were sort of, very welcome. So we joined a lot of the PAP MPs and even the ministers on the sort of the bottom left-hand corner of the members' room, the tea room. And then the WP, during our term, there were just WP MPs. So they were actually occupying the top right-hand corner of the room. But after a while, myself and Walter and then a few other NMPs, we decided that we will situate ourselves in the middle.
Sounds like a different clique right there.
Oh, kind of.
School lunch room.
Yeah, school
I know,
lunch, yeah.
very canteen kind of feel like, okay, this is your clique, that one's my clique. But actually, interestingly, because we chose to sit in the middle, we started also having both the WP MPs and the PAP MPs come join us in the middle.
So it'll be like a bridge, yeah?
That's why I think there's some value in this institutionalized block, right, of independence and non-partisanship. We shouldn't throw the baby out, the water out of the baby, right? Or the baby out with the bath water. Because that is definitely, for me, if I may just continue a little bit, as I mentioned also in the book, in the last chapter, which I contributed, we see the partisan ills that are happening in the mature democracies with two-party systems around the world. Once you have a very entrenched two-party system, it's very hard for independents, right, to actually come forward. And I think that we have this uniquely Singapore parliamentary innovation we've had for the last 30 years. Instead of strengthening it, there are a lot of, weaknesses. Like I said, fair share of criticism. Walter just shared about the contradiction of the scheme. Sure, all of that, none of us are denying it. But why are we not strengthening it instead of compromising on it, right? And weakening it further, especially with what we're seeing around the world, where we really don't want to be heading down the same path of just a two-party system, because it's very difficult for independents to come in. We already have an institutionalized and actually constitutionalized scheme as well, right? It's not even just an act of parliament, it's actually in our constitution.
I just wanted to build on that a little bit because I think, Anthea, you made a very good point there about how it may not necessarily be a two-party system or even a three-party system that would be the best thing to evolve towards or to change towards, right? I mean, I want to say, maybe I don't want to say evolve in case it implies that you have to get there. I think one of the reasons why the NMP scheme was quite interesting is that I think it does allow a number of people who might have some political interest and policy interest and be somewhat successful at, for example, and comfortable with promoting ideas to the public, but who do not actually want to take part in party politics. And I think that describes me to some extent. I mean, to put cards on the table, I actually did volunteer with, the PAP once upon a time. But I really did. But I think the difficulty of party politics, and I think this is something I also saw firsthand as an NMP, right, is that sooner or later, when you're a party politician, and I think this applies, whether you're a PAP, Workers' Party, or whatever, right? Sooner or later, when you're a party politician, there will come a day when you're basically asked to do something that might be against your own personal belief, convictions, or whatever, but which are the interests of your party, and that's when you actually have to pay the price, as it were, right? When I say this, I don't mean it in the sense that you're being asked to do something that compromises Singapore or whatever, right? It's not about that, but it is about things that range from 377A, where we know that a number of politicians and the People's Action Party were almost certainly personally against actually the repeal. I mean, that's almost certain. They were against it, but they had to vote for it because the party whip was being called.
Well, the whip wasn't lifted.
The whip was not being lifted. But
it
that's
did
just
for
one
WP
example.
though. WP
the
lifted
WP lifted the whip for that, yeah. But the point is, political parties need to get things done. And when they need to get things done, they apply basically their own internal political pressure or coercion. And that is when, as a member of parliament, you have to decide what is more important to you. Is your career more important to you in the party, or are your personal beliefs more important? And unfortunately, I would have to say in Singapore, you can't even choose. The reason why you can't even choose is that in Singapore, if a party politician is removed from their party, they immediately lose their seat. So they don't even have the option, as in other countries do, of going against their party and then remaining in parliament. It cannot happen legally in Singapore, constitutionally. So I think that's so coming back to NMP, I mean, that's something NMPs can do. NMPs can choose to vote or to behave according to their own belief and conscience, which can be a good or bad thing, depending, of course, on what their conscience is. But it is something that they have.
Yeah, and to add on to that, if I may, it was very clear to me during my term that there were certain topics, certain issues that clearly would be a high political cost even to the opposition party, right? And that would not be raised by them. So minority interests that would not get them the majority votes, even opposition parties may shy away from. And for me, I saw that very clearly during my term, that even Workers' Party, which actually says Workers' Party, did not actually raise a single issue for the migrant workers, right? But for people like myself and Walter, we don't need the votes. Right? I mean, we don't need votes, and therefore we can actually, raise this issue without fear or favor, and definitely without any sort of political cost, right? To the minority interests, of whether it's migrant workers, whether it's, asking, about PA, People's Association, whether it's also LGBTQ, actually. At that point when we were in Parliament, we were the only ones actually who raised the LGBTQ issues, right, in Parliament. So that's definitely those benefits, right? Because we remember we are actually a majoritarian democracy, right? We're not a proportional representation democracy. So the opposition parties still need to stay with majority interests and dominant narratives to get the votes, for them to get into Parliament.
Anthea, you mentioned earlier that you actually rejected the chance to be an NMP in 2011. So I'm curious to find out what made both of you personally decide that you're going to become a politician without being a politician, as Walter put it.
Yeah, so I think for mine, I think I came up in a very similar way to how most of the academics who are NMPs come up, which is that, and so this is another, I guess, procedural or constitutional point, right? So the Constitution actually does provide that the NMPs should be selected from a certain range of functional groups or sectors. So I won't be able to remember and list all of them off the top of my head, but basically academia, culture and the arts, business sector, they're all listed there. Yeah, business and civic sector people, yeah. So academia is actually one of those sectors or groups in the Constitution. So there's actually a well-defined process in Singapore whereby the autonomous universities actually do submit names to the Special Select Committee, and then the Special Select Committee basically selects one of them, more or less. Or more, at least that's what we understand. So for myself, I think it happened much the same way as it does for any other academic in Singapore, which is, you're just sitting in your office and then one day your provost or somebody walks by and you're like, that's odd. Why the heck is my provost walking by? He never ever comes here. And then, they pop their head in and then, I can't remember whether it's provost or dean, but you get the point, right? Some senior official comes by, they pop their head in and they're like, we're going to submit your name. And you're like, why? You see? And then, okay. And then before you know it, you have to put together the whole dossier and submit and so on. So I tell you, this is almost certainly how it happens for all the academics in Singapore who become NMPs. It's somebody who walks by and tells them, go and submit your name. You're up, Now, whether you get selected or not, I guess depends on whether you do a good or bad job putting together the dossier. But then, you go through the interview process and that's how it happens.
Yeah. For me, I was actually put up by the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Centre because, up to that point, I was very active in the sector, whether it's on the boards as volunteers. I also set up a few social enterprises and some community projects. So they put me up, the chair and the CEO of NVPC. And like Walter, so I was put up under the People and Civic Sector Functional Group. And so for those of you who may not know this, there's actually 2 paths to become part of this NMP pool that could then be, finally selected. There are 9 NMPs that are provided for in the Constitution in every parliament. It went from 3, then 6, then 9 through the years. So the one path is through this functional sectors. So in each of the 6 functional sectors, there's a sector coordinator. So in the people and civic sector, the coordinator is PA. And then I think you have other coordinators. But there's also a route that you can go through the open application, right? So any of you can actually apply. You just have to go through all the requirements. And then to Walter's point, there's a whole selection process that first happens on paper, right? Then, like our cohort, there were 48 applications. The batch after hours was about 63 applications received. And then the final round is an interview where Walter was alluding to the Special Select Committee. And in fact, I have to add, it's not just all PAP. There's one opposition.
It's apportioned to whoever's holding seats in Parliament at the time.
Yeah. So the Special Select Committee would do the in-person interview, and then you just first of all, you're very surprised to be called out for the interview, and then after that you're like, I got it, because actually I didn't think I would get it. I thought I did really poorly in the interview.
Right.
This is the point where we also have to point out that we were reminded at the start of the interview by the chair, who was, I think back then it was the former speaker, right? Tan Chuan Jin. Yeah, we were reminded at the start of the interview that the proceedings of the Special Select Committee are under parliamentary privilege and should not be repeated to anybody. So, really, he did remind us of that,
But the content, not the process.
Yeah, no, the content. So that means that we cannot tell you what the questions are under pain of being found guilty of, I guess, parliamentary privilege breach.
Yes, I guess we have to move on before we get into any trouble. Let's talk about GE, right? Let's have a show of hands here in this room. It's not going in and out. How many of you think that GE will happen this month? April, yeah. May? Oh, that's more than half, I think. June. Oh, couple of hands.
School holiday.
Yeah, school holiday is a bit tough. Yeah, but I think May will be a good bet.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but moving.
Wait, I didn't see Anthea and Walter
Yeah,
raise their
No,
hands.
I did.
May.
For me.
May.
for
Right,
me.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So, moving to GE, I think there are a lot of major issues that are ahead of us. Just like to ask you guys, what do you think? What do you see are the major issues this coming GE?
I think it's the same issue as it's been actually for a long time, which is, and it's the same issue that I think you face in actually all the major democracies, right? People are going to be asking themselves, are we actually better off now than we were at the last general election? And to what extent is the current government responsible for making it better off, or not responsible, as the case may be, for, improving things? And I think that's really the key issue. And so it's basically a referendum, you might say, on the People's Action Party, and in particular, whether they've got the balance right with things like addressing the cost of living, right? So that's a huge issue. But I think also other matters, such as, is the economy in the right direction? Is immigration policy calibrated properly? So I think these are actually the major issues. So it's very, you might say, bread and butter issues, but I think it's always been, frankly. Yeah, so I think that's the main thing.
I would actually share very similar views, but I also feel like we need to, because a lot of this reports that we're seeing recently is just sort of hammering home the cost of living issue, which obviously is a clear and present danger, right, for a lot of people. But I also feel like we must be clear that no one lives a single issue life, right? And so it's really not sort of honing in on, what are the hot button issues, but also, like what Walter said, that was what I was also going to say, that generally, are we feeling better off? Are we feeling safer, more secure? Are we feeling also more confident of the future, right? And I will always still come back to the mental health issues, right? Our mental health issue, COVID has already finished, but the mental health issues has actually escalated, right? Even if you think about the cost of living issue, the reason why there's so much angst and worry, because there's a mental toll, right? A mental toll of saying, am I going to actually make ends meet? So many of my friends who are in businesses, especially F&B, more than a few have had to, close down the business. And yeah, of course, it is a challenge to their financial well-being, but of course, it escalates into their worry about family, and so then it becomes a real, a real worry for what is the future like, right? Because when we think about cost of living, we must not think about just, do we have enough to spend? In fact, there's a study that shows that financial security is actually made of three things. First is, of course, do you have enough to spend, and hopefully with a little bit of leftover. The other is whether you have a sense of control over your financial security. And the third is also what's coming right next. And to that point is why I think the vouchers that were given out during budget helps to address the first part of it, right? Like, okay, help with the spending now, but I don't think it necessarily addressed the other two that people are still worried about, right? Whether I have a control over my, the sense of control over my financial well-being, my financial security, mine and my family's, and then also the future, right? What is the future ahead of me? So yeah, I would say that it's that sense of, do I feel, it's very ontological, do I feel like I'm better off?
Right. I think the ride ahead is going to be quite a topsy-turvy one. Today, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong made a ministerial statement. Drew, could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so since you said he made a ministerial statement in Parliament today, we have an economist here with us, Walter, so we can talk tariffs with him. I think he's the right person to ask about this.
Yes.
PM Wong's speech, I memorized it all by heart, but just in case, I also wrote down the 3 major points that he made. So in case you guys didn't follow Mothership's comprehensive coverage on it, I've got it here for you. The first was he spoke about the wider implications the tariffs will have on global trading, on the global trading system and the world economy. One line that stood out was PM Wong's disappointment at the US's decision to impose tariffs on Singapore. especially considering the deep and long-standing friendship between our two countries. He said, he called it not actions one does to a friend. The second major point he made was about its implications on Singapore. Singapore can expect weaker global growth and weaker external demand for our goods and services. Sectors like manufacturing, transport, wholesale, trade and finance will be affected. And third, he also spoke about how the Singapore government will support Singaporeans during this period of uncertainty. He said that the government will set up a task force chaired by DPM Gan Kim Yong to help businesses and workers address the immediate uncertainties. They will work with the Singapore Business Federation, the Singapore National Employers Federation, and the NTUC. So Walter, you're an economist. Help us make sense of all of this.
Yeah, so I think there is no quite very pithy answer I can give to this, but it's interesting because I think it makes me realize at least that a lot of our success today, right, economic success today, is due essentially to having the right policies at the right time. And what I refer to as the right policies, with regards to this debate, is actually that we decided very early on at independence that we were going to continue the policy of basically trying to maximize our advantage as a trading hub, right, to basically seek every last advantage as a trading center at the time when globalization was actually really just getting started in the post-war era. And also at the time, I have to add, when it was not obvious that the right policy was actually to open yourself up to trade, foreign investment, and so on, primarily aligning with the Western capitalistic model. It was not obvious, right? Because if we cast our mind back to the 60s and 70s, there was a very strong competing point of view, either that, for example, capitalism was not the way to go, you go with the communist bloc instead, or perhaps a more non-aligned protectionist point of view, which is that actually your strength would come from building up your own industries rather than, letting foreign investment and so on in and, retooling yourself to export. So we made a very, I would say, we made a policy bet that turned out to be extraordinarily good because, as we know, ex post, right, that was actually the fastest way to develop economically, and countries which failed to make that bet at the right time actually didn't take off. And countries like China, for example, today, who are doing so well economically, they started their rapid development process much later than us because they didn't make that bet until, the 1980s and so on. So we made the right bet at the right point in time. But what is happening today is that you might say the progenitors of that great globalization experiment, the United States, right, is basically turning their back on that bet, right, or turning their back on that policy. That's what's going on. So they've basically decided that for their own political reasons, the gains to trade are not there, right? And, in turning their back on, you might say, the globalized trading order that they set up, that has profound implications because, well, one, it's not clear, right, that actually the rest of the global trading system or regime is going to survive that exactly intact, right? A lot of countries actually want to retaliate, but more than just retaliation and so on, it's, I think, the fundamental underpinning of the global trading system. It actually really did benefit from having this hegemon, which had a core interest in sustaining it. And also, I mean, as much as people don't like it, also a core interest in providing the military support and so on, and political support to basically keep trading lane open, to keep everybody in line and things like that. A lot of people here, of course, don't like that, but the question is, who's going to replace the United States if the United States doesn't have an interest in doing that? Is it going to be the European Union? I think we all know they have a great difficulty actually having influence beyond just their backyard. Is it going to be China? Sure, it could be China, but that is a neighbor, right? A nearby neighbor, which is much more fraught, I think, with tension for the region compared to the United States, which is thousands of miles away. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, resulting from that. And maybe I think, besides just talking up doom and gloom, I think it's worthwhile thinking a bit, reflecting a bit on how a country which has arguably benefited so much from global trade, which is the United States, could have come to this point of reversing their policy. How could they have come to this point, right? And I think to reflect on that, it's worth thinking in Singapore ourselves about a policy that Singapore has arguably benefited from tremendously, but which Singapore is extremely close to reversing on a daily basis, and that is immigration, right? Because for Singaporeans, immigration is what free trade is to the United States. It is a policy that has almost certainly brought huge benefit to Singapore over the years, but it is a policy also which has created many winners and losers in Singapore, and one for which ordinary Singaporeans, you and I, daily wonder, should we continue with this policy or not, or should we actually close up? And should we not take in new immigrants and so on? Just as the United States asked themselves, well, free trade might be bringing us cheap goods, imports, and things like that allows us to export our items, but is it causing us to lose too many jobs? Is it causing us to lose our industrial heartland? Is the cost, higher than the benefit? So we ask ourselves the same question too when it comes to immigration. So, it may be obvious to us that the United States, in our view, is making the wrong decision, but I want to say that we could very easily make a decision that we could also come to regret later on a policy which is actually quite important to us as well. And it's a policy which, because it creates winners and losers, is something that we're going to have a very difficult time dealing with. Right?
Well, my take obviously is more from a lay person than someone with this expertise. One of the things that I immediately thought of, which I think, if I'm not wrong, Lawrence did mention also today, because the first thing that struck me was, okay, is this then an opportunity for us to really think about as citizens, how open are we truly, right, as a economy and as a trading partner? Have we, over the years, taking advantage of what Walter was sharing of a globalized order, been actually quite dominated in our trading relationships, by a few. In this case, of course, US is a big one. And so then it gives us an opportunity to reflect, do we now truly, go into the ASEAN economic community in a big way? Do we really start to generate the trade that we should, now? And now it's a better time than the best time than any time. So that came up for me, right? In terms of the opportunity of looking at, has our trade been primarily with the global north, right? With Europe and US. So then that allows us for some sort of recalibration and reframe. The other, which has come up in some of the conversations I've had, is that the 10% tariff apparently is only on goods, but we also export services. And services, it's not actually a small amount. So I would also, as a citizen, like to know, right, how much of those services are affected, and what's the quantum, what's the amount? And is this actually as alarming as it is? I'm not, of course, making light the situation. It is a shock to the global system and therefore to us. But when I realized that the tariffs are only on the goods and not on the services, then that got me curious about what does that mean for us, right? And this is with the United States. The third is, also wanting to not go into a apocalyptic kind of a state, but to think about, as in Chinese, we have crisis is 危机, right? It's made up of the word 危, which is 危险, danger, threat, and 机 is 机会, which is opportunity. So as much as we want to be very clear-eyed of the dangers, of the threats, of the way, we must also now look at, what are the 机会, what are the opportunities. And one of which I think is start to recalibrate our trading partners and start to not be too over dependent on only certain trading partners. And then we can truly be said to be an open economy that has, trades with trading relationships with all over. Because I remember when during COVID, Minister Chan Chun Sing came out to share that we had to, because of COVID, change our policy on the source of so many of the food imports. Because before, we were very reliant on only a certain number of partners where we source our eggs and chicken and all that. And because of COVID, we started to diversify. So I think this could be an opportunity for us to really relook at, our kind of a trading portfolio if you will.
Xingqi,
Yeah.
we're in the sanctuary of all knowledge in Singapore and US.
Yes.
What's your knowledge of international relations and global macroeconomics? On a scale of 1 to 100, what's your knowledge?
Well, probably the negative for me. I am clearly not here to answer your question.
Okay, but you have
It's too hard for me. But
you have friends, right?
I have friends. I mean,
Would you tax a friend? Would you put a tariff on a friend?
I think that's what the Gen Z call it, the phantom tax or something.
Phantom tax.
Yeah.
Phantom.
Phantom. Yeah. You know when you eat, you take the food.
Are you aware of this term, phantom tax?
No,
Yeah.
no.
Oh, wow. Let me educate you.
Really dates me,
Xingqi,
man.
go
Okay,
ahead.
please.
Oh,
What's a phantom tax?
I think you're closer to Gen Z than me. Yo.
I've certainly got more hair. That's true.
Fair enough.
That's when, as a friend, you take food from your friend, and it's called a phantom tax.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one for you guys to use in the future. You can have that one for free.
Yeah.
No tariffs.
I mean, one question that would come out for me is that how do we define a friend?
Oh, interesting.
Right? Because
Right, yeah.
would you call we have this saying that a friend in need is a friend indeed.
Yes.
And so until we know whether that party is going to come to us when we are in
Are
need.
you guys friends?
Yeah.
You have a beer or something?
We have had coffee.
There's-
I don't
no
drink.
tea?
No tea. He's still trying to get us to tell him about the tea sessions.
Yeah, but I want to take this very complex global topic locally. Yeah, I wonder whether this would affect voting behavior. You know, I think over the past weekend, the PSP, Dr. Chan Chingbok and Mr. Leong Wan Wai talk about it is kind of from the government's point of view is to instill fear in the voter, and that this matter is overblown. What's your take on that?
I mean, okay, I don't think the matter is overblown because I think we are seeing the beginning actually of quite a fundamental change in how the global economy is going to be structured, right? But at the same time, I don't think that it is an issue that necessarily means that one should, just vote, for example, for the incumbent or anything like that. I mean, I think it is a situation where, if opposition political parties, consider this as a serious part of the environment they have to deal with, they have to make the case for Singaporeans that diversity, for example, in parliament, alternative voices and so on, being able to bring up some of the issues that actually plague, ordinary Singaporeans in a way that's independent of government policy, right? These are things that would actually add strength to us rather than, for example, cause issues, right? And likewise, of course, the government, the People's Actions Party, they are perfectly at liberty to stress how, you need unity, you need a firm mandate, blah, 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 that kind of thing, right? I mean, I'm not going to oversell them too much. I think you'll hear them selling this point quite a lot. But
your days
my
of
point is,
volunteering are over.
yeah. But my point is that there are reasonable, I think, arguments that could be made on either side for either voting for the incumbent or voting for the opposition, right? So, but I think my own view, right? And of course, I'm not going to, second guess the PSP here, but my own view is that I think all of the parties have to actually take this very seriously, because even if the tariffs were reversed in part or whatever, or even in full, right? I think what they have shown is that the United States under the current administration is actually not a reliable global partner. And if they're not a reliable global partner, a lot of the things that we do going forward, they really have to be rethought or re-strategized. And that's something that all Singaporeans have to be concerned with, whether you happen to be, PAP leaning, opposition leaning. That's something all of us are concerned with. I think the other point I would just add, just very quickly here, is that I keep coming back to thinking again, about how do we deal with, you might say, the discontents or the unhappiness of globalization, right? Which I think in Singapore's case is not about trade, but really, as I said earlier, it's about basically the consequences of the labor market, especially from immigration, where people worry about getting good jobs, whether good jobs are going to foreigners, things like that. And that's something that really requires, I think, a lot of debate, but also I think very serious treatment from both the government and opposition. The government, I think as it stands, has to be careful that they don't just assume that Singaporeans support, for example, the government's policy on this, or can be convinced to support the government's policy on this without having a full debate about the consequences, and also I think more access to the data and so on. And I think the opposition as well, if they act responsibly, I think has to bring up these issues, because they're not encumbered by having to uphold existing government policy, because I think we do have to come to better decisions about this. If we don't get on top of this, right, then I do think that the government of the day, whoever it is, would very well likely be forced to completely reverse major parts of policy, which might have very serious negative consequences to Singapore. Just as I see today that the reversal of trade policy in the US, and even when you look at Europe, the reversal of a lot of policies about openness and so on, have to do with the governments of the day completely failing to get on top of how their citizens feel about these issues, and as a result, in my view, enacting policies which are akin to shooting themselves in the foot. But we will shoot ourselves in the foot, I think, without a functioning political system. And yeah, in my view at the moment, that requires both the PAP to deal with the issue, I think, with a lot more data and with more room for contestation than they have historically, and also for the opposition to get in there and to basically duke it out, but responsibly. That's my view.
For me, I think GE 2020, we were actually right in the thick of a crisis, and I remember when we were still in Parliament, we were part of the pandemic parliament that had to debate 4 budgets within 2 months, that we kept saying unprecedented, unparalleled crisis, a crisis of a generation, right? Even then, we didn't see a flight to safety, right? Where the voters are concerned. I mean, I'm answering your question to whether there will be a impact on the voters' behavior. I think it's important to note that Singapore voters are discerning. Certainly increasingly over the years, we are more educated, we're more informed. I would also want to say that we are more engaged. I also want to say that, thanks to people like yourselves, but also the different podcasts, it's also opened up and expanded the public squares, right, for a lot more political and civic engagement. So I really don't think that, we're going to see voters just take the sort of the reflexive flight to safety. But I do want to say, I don't think it's responsible for leaders of the country, whether you're opposition or incumbent, to either trivialize what's going on, which are real. These are factual realities that are happening, right? Nor to, sell it as, a calamity, right? That there's no other way out. I think for leaders in a time of great disruption, and I will put on my hat as a leadership coach, quoting you this massive multi-year Gallup study that tells you what followers need from leaders in times of disruption. And there are 4 qualities, right? First is trust. The second is compassion. The third is stability, and the last is hope, right? So if we want to, as leaders, and our leaders meaning from all parties, right? You should actually be making sure that you're able to hold all of these 4 qualities, given the disruption, given the challenges, really real challenges that we are actually heading towards. Not to make light, but don't oversell the gloom and doom. And also, after a while, if you oversell the gloom and doom, I think it can come across to discerning voters as a bit of a cry wolf. So it's also not the best strategy.
Yeah, and Anthea, I mean, earlier you spoke, when we asked you about, major issues coming up to GE, you spoke about mental health, right? And I thought that was so masterful how you can massage everything to speak about mental health. And you've been so consistent in your advocacy about that issue, the last 10, 15 years, maybe throughout your time in Parliament, 20 years.
20 since my own lived experience
okay.
with personal brush depression, yeah.
Yeah. My mom tells me with a woman you should always underestimate the amount of years rather than overestimate. So I went with,
Good tip.
10, 15.
Good tip.
But I'm wondering, I mean, when you, as you look at how Singapore has developed over the last 5 years since you were an NMP, how do you feel we have grown in this area of mental health?
Thank you for asking this question. So I remember one of our fellow NMPs would come to me and said, how is it that you could squeeze in mental health in every bill that you speak up on, even if it's like electronic payment services bill, you know? And I think that speaks to that actually everything we do affects our mental health, right? I have actually committed to championing and advocating and pushing for change in this, and also to put mental health front and center. Because if we talk about mental health, if we think about mental health in policymaking, in leadership, in schools, then we will always remember we are dealing with humans. It will always allow us to come back and center on humans when we are able to think about the impact of anything we do on the well-being, the mental health of the other person or the group of people we are leading, right? I must say I've been very heartened with how we've moved. Of course, for the longest time, you know, in the community, we were pushing for so many changes, and that's why I took the opportunity of the 2-year term to push for every change possible across the government, with every ministry. And COVID did what so many of us in the sector couldn't do for years and years. You know, COVID really escalated so many of the, you know, policy decisions and also actions because it actually spotlight on a problem that we've always had, but it actually had become a bigger problem. And so I've been very heartened that many of what the sector and the community wanted me to bring to Parliament, whether it's, you know, my first speech in the Employment Amendment Bill talking about putting more emphasis on workplace well-being for workers, to my first budget talking about a national mental health office to coordinate across the agencies and ministries, to making mental health education compulsory in all schools, which it has. They're still implementing it, but the directive is clear. Since January 2023, it's compulsory for all schools to have mental health education. So it's been really heartening for me and the sector to see a lot of what we have had push starting to be realized into action, but we still have a long way to go, right? I mean, of course, with the launch of the National Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy, and then having that full debate, I was seriously FOMO, you know. Last year when they did the February mental health motion, I'm like, I wanted to have this. We talked about this amongst NMPs that we wanted to table a motion on mental health, like, because we represent different parts of the sector and we wanted to talk about mental health that way. So I definitely had FOMO lah, but I was really, really pleased to note that 21 MPs spoke up and debated on that mental health motion. So we've definitely come a long way, but there's still a long way to go in terms of some of our policies that need to be changed. We have a world-class healthcare system, but we don't yet have a world-class mental health care system. But it's not just the downstream. We also have to go upstream in education, in the workplace and all of that.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time. We'd like to share you guys with the NUSS members. So we open up the questions to the floor.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, good evening panel. My name is Tim, NUSS member, and also NUS alumni. Maybe I should ask Ms. Anthea and Prof. Walter, on hindsight, do you think what is something that you hope you could do better as an MMP if you have the chance to maybe serve beyond that normal 2.5 terms, and perhaps in jest, do you think that the NMP remuneration is sufficient and could it be better enhanced so that more people will nominate themselves to be NMP? Thank you.
What is the NMP remuneration?
So it's all on the website. So for elected MPs, they get about 20,000. It's 19,000 something, right? Before CPF and all that. So the NMPs and NCMPs were 10% of that. And so Walter and I used to joke that we're the NCMPs get more. NCMPs get more, but we used to joke that we're the low-wage workers in Parliament. And my dad was very disappointed. My dad thought that I was getting what the elected MPs. So when I shared with him, he was like, "Huh? Then why you work so hard? Why are you so pia? Why are you so chong?" So I think that's a great question. We certainly have raised this, not so much about the compensation, but more the support resources. So other than the salary being 10% of elected MPs, NMPs and NCMPs do not get support in secretarial resources as well as legislative support, right? So in other words, we would have to do our own research, our own writing, our own, everything. So that part, both Walter and I did raise it during our term. That was maybe important because once we are in Parliament, we understand maybe the salary needs to be more because as NMPs, we don't have to walk the ground, we don't have to do much of the constituency work, right? And also the town council part of it. But when in Parliament, we are expected and called to do just as much as the other MPs. So where the legislative support is concerned, we felt, it should be sort of fair game for all the MPs in the House, in the August chamber. What would I have done more if we continued for another term? And I see this in the book, so please buy the book in the last chapter.
Don't worry, we're going to force you guys to buy it.
Yeah. Don't force. I would have liked to do the mental health motion, but I'm glad it still got done, right? Even if it's sort of, 4 years later. So that was one that we didn't get to do. The other that I really wanted to do after I was introduced to the Mindful Parliament motion that UK Parliament tabled. Mindful Parliament meaning that they got all members of Parliament to be trained in mindfulness, right? So that they are very present when they are in Parliament and they listen to each other. They're not talking over each other. They're not shouting. I mean, it still applies.
It doesn't seem to have worked. It doesn't seem to have worked with the UK.
They have not, but I thought it would be really good for us because I felt like it would then get us to maybe, but they in UK, I must say, they do come together to do bipartisan projects, right? And that's something I would love to see us do more of, right, in Parliament. So that was also the other thing I wish I had done, and I wanted to do. I started some bits of it, and then COVID hit, and Parliament got dissolved, so I didn't get to do that.
So I think my take on it is that it's not a salary issue but basically it is a resource issue, and it ties into the salary issue in the following way, that I think for most people who are nominated as NMPs, right, I think the reality is they can only contribute as much as they can basically get time off from whatever the day job or whatever is to contribute. And the general thing is most people who are nominated are actually in senior enough positions or flexible enough positions such that they can choose to do that. So, it's not a salary thing for them, but it's really the kind of position they hold. And what this means is that if, for example, you ever wanted somebody to represent your interests in Parliament, whether you're an elected member, right, or whether you're an NMP, and you wanted that person to come from a background which wasn't, for example, elite professional, or senior manager or whatever, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because somebody who is not an elite professional and not a senior management person cannot get the time off to actually do the work, right? They could be in Parliament, sure, but they really wouldn't have time to do anything. That's one thing. And I think relating to the resource issue, and this is not just about NMPs, it's also about the elected members of Parliament. The elected members of Parliament do get a small parliamentary budget to hire a legislative assistant and so on. But as far as I remember, the budget amounts are stuck at some level that was actually developed, in the 90s or something. I mean, I could be wrong, it might have been revised by now, but this is my understanding back then, that it was stuck at that level, which means that the elected members cannot do much more than maybe pool some money together and hire some assistants and so on to do the legislative work, right? And even when you talk about the rest of the budget, rest of the allowance, sure, they may have the discretion to spend that allowance on hiring help. They also have to give part of it to the political party for activities and so on. But basically, there's severe resource constraints, I would say. I know it sounds ironic, right? Because the public is thinking, wow, what are you talking about? Resource constraint. These guys get paid millions of dollars or whatever. But, that's actually the political office holders. The members of parliament, sure, they get the allowance, but they actually don't have that many resources to actually do, you might say, their legislative work. And that's where I think I come to the hindsight part. Yeah, what could be done better? What would I do if I had more time or whatever? I think it's not just me, but I think it's Parliament as a whole. It would be really useful, I feel, for Parliament to, for the legislative side, the members of Parliament, to basically take more of an active role in actually scrutinizing policy on a day-to-day basis, getting feedback from people and so on, and basically trying to come up with their own ideas as Parliament on what should be done about things, right? Because the way that policy making largely works in Singapore is that we have the civil service and the government of the day basically developing all of the policies and leading the process of policy development and engagement of the public. Now, I mean, of course, I agree that individual members of parliament in different areas may contribute. So if you're a member of parliament for the labour movement, they can contribute from their perspective from labour, business sector, so on and so forth. But we do not actually have the kinds of committees that in other parliaments exist, which look into specific functional areas of policy, think about it, call for meetings, call for evidence and so on. We don't. And in fact, even for the standing committees of parliament, nominated members of parliament, from what I understand, I don't think they've ever served in those committees either.
No. And there isn't those committees. I mean, so in other parliaments, because we do parliamentary exchanges, and so when I was sent to UK, you notice that there are these committees that Walter is talking about. So over time, they develop a certain expertise. Right? And so these are also almost always made up of all parties, of the House, not just one party. What we have though, although it's quite different, it serves a different purpose, are the government parliamentary committees, which is the GPCs, but they're all made up of only members of parliament from the government. Right? So that won't give you the diversity that's needed. That I think is very important, and even more so going forward when the world is now so volatile, so uncertain. There's no really, anyone who has all the answers. So you really need a diversity to be able to sort of come up with, the kind of solutions that we need going forward. So hopefully I think that's...
Actually, let's take the next two questions together. So we've got one on the right and one on the left. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Chong Ki Chung, a USS member. I'd like to seek your opinion on cost of living issue. In the environment of business seems to be competing to increase prices. What would be a good way that consumer association can play a good role to curtail profiteering? Maybe I'd like to get your opinion on that. What would be a good way?
Okay, and sir, on the left, your question?
Yeah, today's topic is about the general election. I mean, beyond NMP and tariffs, right? I was a bit surprised we never touched on the topic of the election boundaries at all. So, I mean, to Walter's point earlier on about how come mature democracies move towards a 2 or 3 party system and Singapore is still not there. I'm wondering whether, after the election boundaries was released, there was a lot of accusation of gerrymandering. That's nothing new, of course. About transparency, not just of the election commission, but also of the lopsidedness in terms of the number of voters to per candidate ratio, the value of each vote. That part is also highly lopsided. Yes. So my question is the ruling party so afraid of losing more seats that they have to resort to this, given that they are in such a dominant position. I mean, if we didn't have this kind of things like POFMA or gerrymandering, do you really think that they will lose that many seats and threaten their actual existence at all?
Wow.
Okay, so for our politicians who are not politicians, one question on cost of living and how consumer associations can play a role, and one question on the EBRC.
Maybe I'll just chime in, where the question on cost of living is concerned. I think I already sort of mentioned it a little bit. One area that I think we really need to start thinking about is doing something about rentals, right? Because many of especially the SMEs and certainly in the F&B sector, many of them have come to me. Not that I could do anything because I'm already not in Parliament, but many are sort of struggling and wondering why there isn't anything done to this, never-ending increase in rentals, right? And so some of you may know that I'm actually in the social enterprise space, So in some ways, I'm also an SME owner, but I'm also operating within the social enterprise space where there are social entrepreneurs who are setting up social enterprises to employ people with special needs, and some of these are cafes. And even with the social enterprises, the landlords are still, showing them with a 20 to 30% rental increase. There's just no way the business can actually see a growth of 20 to 30%, right? So actually quite a number of them are going to give up their spaces and therefore their businesses. So whether consumer association can do something, that's one part of it, pushing for some sort of action. I also think that there's probably a need for both the government and the trade association and the bodies to come together and look at how we can actually together, organize the landlords, to ask them to do something as a collective, right? I mean, I remember during COVID, there were so many business people who came to me to ask me to raise their challenges of rentals and business costs. And I had to very gently turn them away, saying that there is actually a business NMP, and we only have how many questions we can ask and how many minutes during the budget and committee of supply. So I wanted to keep them for the people and civic sector. But many of them shared with me that, the same issue with the rental increase. Of course, in COVID, as you all remember, there was a rental relief that was given to SMEs, but that was one-off. But actually, a few of them, the tenants form a cooperative to push for more changes. But I don't think they're still able to do much if the landlords don't come together and say, what is the right thing to do for Singapore? Right? Not asking you to not actually make money, but in a time like this, do we all still need to keep, squeezing from our tenants? And in these double-digit numbers of 20 to 30%, that's really substantial, right? So that's one response I would give. The EBRC. So I actually belong to a double-barrel GRC now, right? Marine Parade, Bridal Heights. It was not a surprise to me that the boundaries will be redrawn at all. I was completely expecting it. And I was expecting that there will be changes. And I think to some extent, I may represent the resilience of the voters. Because if you have come to expect it, you're not actually going to be shocked. And therefore, you're not going to be sort of displaced or anything. But I would like to share your point about that voter equality or voter representation. Where I haven't done a really in-depth analysis, but, it's important for us to see whether each voter is actually given fair representation. Because for certain constituencies and GRCs, you may have one MP to 30,000 voters and another may be 20,000, right? Which also means that the the voter has a better chance of getting better represented, in other words, both in, especially in parliament, but certainly in terms of the town council attention and all of that at the municipal level, right? So I think that part has not been sort of put out, so as a voter, as we continue to become smarter, more engaged, more informed voters, we also need to ask, and that was a question I posed in my post actually, do you know your representation ratio, right, for your own constituency? So that's one part. The other part, and I've always shared this, the other part, it's also a little bit of the issue that I have with GRCs is because they always say NMP not democratic and all that, but actually GRC also has an undemocratic component, which is that, and I've heard this, right, which is that because you never quite know whether every single polling district, which obviously doesn't happen, every polling district actually is first past the post, right? Whether every polling district, every ward within the GRC actually get more than 50% of the vote. So there might be polling districts within the GRC who have not actually chosen that MP who's become the MP for the district, that is actually not, more than majority, not more than 50%. So that is the part that I've always, questioned the GRC, because that part to me, it's not democratic. That would be my response to you. But the voter representation, means something for me lah. So I really want to go and investigate what is my MP to voter ratio.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the profiteering one first, and then I'll talk about EVRC as well. Okay, so for profiteering, I think here's the tension, right? I think the problem we run into in Singapore is that we are pretty much up against the limits of the market system at the moment in terms of what we can accept. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean is this problem, right? We see a lot of things I think we don't like in Singapore today. We see high business rentals, we see high prices of hawker food, for example. We see, our heritage food disappearing and so on. But actually, the problem is a lot of these outcomes we see are the consequence of the market system in Singapore working well rather than it working badly. What do I mean by that? I mean, the fact is that if a heritage hawker disappears from your local hawker center, and that is because not enough people bought their food, right? That is the consequence in the market system. Basically, the market is reallocating that hawker stall, that coffee shop stall, to some other hawker who maybe is coming from a chain or something, maybe has, I don't know, a more efficient method of production, whatever it is. Maybe you don't like the food quite as much, but they can make money, they can pay the rent, and that's basically why eventually they get allocated that stall. And I think the problem here is we can all agree this doesn't seem to be a great outcome, okay? I mean, I think a lot of us like our heritage hawker food, or we feel very sympathetic for the elderly hawker who was maybe forced up by high rents. But if we don't have an alternative way of allocating all these spaces other than using the market, then what are we going to do about it? And that's really the problem, because to come back to the question of, what's wrong with profiteering, right? Of course, we don't like it, but actually, the best way to deal with profiteering is for the market to be competitive. But if the market is competitive, then we must also accept that the end result of the system is that things get allocated according to market forces, which is not necessarily an outcome we want. So, to really address this, we're probably going to have to think about, for example, for hawker centers which are owned and operated by NEA, right? If we really want to be serious about this, we have to think about alternative methods for allocating the stalls which don't have to do with, basically a bidding system. We have to think about ways of allocating it according to taste, heritage, whatever it is. That means that you're going to have to accept a certain amount of messiness and inefficiency, which may not be helpful for competition, right, necessarily, but these are things that we have to start thinking about a bit more. So that's one view I have. Then for electoral boundaries, right? I've often thought about why it is that the government, the People's Action Party, seems to be so concerned about this concept or this theory of a freak election, blah, 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 and so on, right? Which is maybe tangentially related to this issue. And I think the problem is this. The big difference between Singapore electoral districts and those that you find in many other countries is that our electoral districts are largely speaking all the same. They're all the same because, I don't mean that, like they're all in the same place. What I mean is that they're all the same and that most of them are based on HDB housing estates in Singapore, which have fairly similar levels of income, fairly similar demographics, and thanks to, for example, the ethnic, quota policy in HDB housing have very similar levels of ethnic representation. Of course, that's not completely exactly the same. It's well known that GRCs and HDB towns in the eastern part of Singapore have got a higher percentage Malay population than elsewhere, right? So these things are well known. But it all operates within certain bounds because of policy. And when you have homogeneity in electoral districts, that means that you actually have no home base. That's a very important point to note, okay? So yeah, today when we look at Singapore political districts, we think, obviously it's a home base what? You look at Ang Mo Kio, obviously that's the senior minister's home base. But no, it's his base because he has been there for a long time and he used to be the prime minister. There's nothing inherent or natural about Ang Mo Kio being a People's Action Party ward. And this is completely different from, let's say, United States, the UK, most other countries where a particular area votes consistently for a particular party or particular style of politics or view because their natural interests are in that direction. A rural area of the US will always vote for a candidate which is going to support farming interests. It's obvious. But in Singapore, everybody has the same interest by and large across all of Singapore. Maybe excepting like Holland Bukit Timah or something, which I think is different, right? But everywhere else the same, okay? So because of that, I think this is why the ruling party is so concerned about this concept of a freak election. And it's also why I think the opposition can make inroads anywhere in Singapore if they put up, credible candidates. And if they target politicians, PAP politicians who's not so popular. Obviously, you don't go after the senior minister, but there are plenty of other people you could go after. And yeah.
Name someone.
Yeah, name someone.
I'm not going to name.
There are. It's gonna be. Yeah, there are people going after the senior minister. What do you mean?
They are but I think
in the house,
nobody.
right? Right?
But people are not expecting them to do that well But anyway, but you get the point right? And so coming back to this whole electoral boundaries thing, how can we have a system that maybe doesn't rely on so much redistricting and so on, and can accommodate the plurality of views, while I would say also still returning what most Singaporeans want today, which is to return the People's Action Party to power, right? How do you get that? And obviously one way of getting that would be to completely do away with the idea of electoral boundaries, at least for representation in government, and to instead move to something like proportional representation, or to have a split system where your boundaries actually are for voting into power your local leaders, which means to say the people who control your town council and things like that, but you have a separate and parallel system for electing basically the balance of the legislature to make policies and so on. You could have that system. And I think there could be some merits to the system because even today, people have brought up the observation that, somebody who they want to represent policies and so on in Parliament may not be exactly the same person that they want to represent the town council, which again may not be the same person as they want to be a minister, right? Or political office holder. All of these talents may not be found in the same person. That's the issue, yeah? But our current political system forces all the talents to be found in the same person, and that's not always something that I think makes a lot of sense.
But that's also by policy, right? To have the MPs be also, the town managers. That's also by policy. So if you look at some of the other political systems around the world, it's not. Right? They can be purely lawmakers. And I think at this point, it might be also important. I think you mentioned that this is also about election. I thought I'll just also take this time to share that as we head into election, we must also understand what is it that a parliament does, right? And therefore, what are the roles of a member of parliament? So that's all on the website of Parliament of Singapore, right? There are three main functions of the Parliament. And one is obviously lawmaking. The second is actually questioning and holding the government to account in terms of its policies and actions. And the third is financial scrutiny. That means the oversight of financial matters. That's the budget and the Committee of Supply. And therefore, these three roles should also be how we must also assess our candidates, as we head into election, and not just about their role in the town council, not just about the estate level role. And And I think that is important for us to come back to basics, right? Because if the parliament functions for that three roles, are the MPs, in the past, in the last term, have they done also these other three roles? That's part of their role in parliament. I think that's also really important. The other, if I can share, also in a discussion that I just had, also on GE 2025, is that as we head into election, often there's just so much noise and so much sound bites. And we talked about relatability, we talk about, humble backgrounds, we talk about, which estate, MPs used to live in. I think it's important to realize that we actually are the employers when it comes to an election, right? We are employing a candidate to do a good job for the next 5 years, and together shaping the future of the country. And so we need to also put on the head of an employer in assessing this candidate. Of course, in job interview, we have a bit of small talk, understand a bit of the candidate's, family background, likes, interests. But ultimately, we need to go beyond that, right? When we finally want to offer the job to the candidate. And I think it's important because just so much, going on. One of our fellow NMPs just said that it's just, it's this politicking getting a bit too unbearable, too much. And it's barely started. We haven't even announced it yet, So I just hope that, we go back to what are we actually electing our member of parliament for. They're called member of parliament. They have a role to play in parliament. And then, of course, we, as what Walter said, we need to also consider what they have done in the estate, but must not forget the other part.
Yeah. On a similar vein, I want to close off the night by asking you guys a last question. What is something that Singaporeans need to think about a bit more, about when deciding who to vote for?
I think if I may add on to what I just shared about, reframing ourselves from voter to employer of this person, and you're hiring the best candidate for the job. I would also add that it's also not just competence that we are looking at in choosing this leader. It's also important to look at their ethical commitments to the role. When I say ethical, I mean, are they going to show up, right? Are they, and of course the ethical standards that we all expect. Because ultimately, this is someone we want to trust, and trust comes with not just competence, but also, it's not just that you can do the job, but also, are you going to be reliable? Are you going to be ethical? And are you going to be showing up when you need to? The other thing that I would like to also urge all members of parliament, as much as it's important to play the role and to make sure that you do really well in town council management and estate management, and the bread and butter issues that Walter alluded to, it's also our duty to guide our constituents, our residents, that there are actually a lot of other issues beside estate issues that we as citizens must be concerned with, right? Whether it's mental health, climate change, and also our foreign policies, right? Often, it may seem, and even things like, arts and culture and all of that, that we keep saying that, oh no, our MPs poor thing lah, they have to only sort of respond to residents, ask for bread and butter issues, estate issues, leave a car park, sheltered walkways. I'm not dismissing that as, as important. Of course, or as unimportant they are, but it's also in our responsibility as leaders to make sure we let our residents and constituents know what are the other issues that are plaguing Singapore as a country now and also going into the future. And then we can stop saying bread butter issue, abstract issues, and I get that a lot. I get a lot of hate mail for bringing up a lot of these like abstract issues like mental health, climate change, even migrant workers. And I say, but it will affect us. If we don't take care of them, it will affect us, right? So I think it's important for also leaders to do that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this a while, and I think one of the amusing things I think as Singaporeans is we want a total mess of contradictions, okay, in terms of who we elect to parliament. What do I mean by that? I was looking at this, I think another clip I saw on TikTok or something a while back, right? People were talking about how, electing this MP again is the time of year when all the MPs pretend that they're just like us and then they eat at the hawker center like just like us again, right? And I just thought to myself, yeah, this is such a mess of contradictions because you want somebody you can relate to who eats at the hawker center of you. At the same time, I'm very sure that most Singaporeans would never think about voting for somebody who has not achieved a certain amount of success in their profession, career, or whatever. People want an every person, and yet they also want to vote into power somebody who is not ordinary in the sense of having way above average, career, income, whatever it is, right? What other contradictions? We want somebody who is like the perfect family person. At the same time, we expect that person to spend every single weekend and evening with us, his or her constituents, tending to our needs. Come on, I mean, all these weekends also, yeah. So anyway, okay, get away from all that, right? First, I think sort out a bit of our own contradictions about this impossible person we want to elect. But for myself, I think the person I would want to elect would be somebody whom I think is willing to lose their job and their position in order to do what they felt was the right thing. Okay, for Singapore or for themselves, or in terms of their convictions or whatever it was. And by this I don't mean like going against their political party and getting booted out. I mean also doing things which they know would be almost certain to lose them political support in the next election, but they went ahead and did it anyway because they felt it was the right thing to do. I mean, of course, this cannot apply to every single thing. If literally every politician did this, I guess we'd probably have a dissolved government in a couple of years, but you get where I'm going with this, right? I think in politics, it's very tempting to remember, right, that ultimately you can only enact your big policies, your dreams of Singapore and so on if you retain political power. And that is why for every politician, probably one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is to get re-elected. You don't get re-elected, no need to talk, right? Because you cannot get anything done or you can't hold the government to the grindstone and things like that. But at the same time, if you have no, moral or ethical core principle about yourself, that you happen to think that you're doing this job and you're in office for a certain reason, you have a belief about it, a conviction about it. If you don't have that, then what do you have, right? Because then all you have is somebody who will just respond to whatever they think the public wants, even if they're convinced that the public doesn't necessarily want something that is in the public's own interest at that point in time. So you have to have that core about you. Hopefully we elect people who will know which hill to die on, basically, and will be willing to lose power and influence to do what they think is right.
Can I just also add that actually I do think that it is a position of privilege and therefore it is a position of responsibility. It's not a position of entitlement. I can't agree with Walter more in terms of that moral and ethical core that must come through the character, right? I would have to say though that because of that, it is okay because we all expect more of leaders anyway in any domain of our work and our life, right? We do expect more of leaders, but leaders must also see that as a privilege and therefore a responsibility.
Yeah, I think we can agree that we should be looking to elect an MP who will not be afraid to lose their job for doing the right thing. Okay, I think Xingqi, thank you for spending your Tuesday evening with me. Anthea, Walter, thank you so much to you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and thank you to you guys as well. I think that's all the time that we have for tonight.
Yes, but remember to pick up this book. On the way out, yeah.
He's very good. He's much better than me.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.